Happy Friday. John Lorden here with your new episode of BrainScratch. Feels like it's been a little while. Decided I'm going to do a little bit of a different story. I do a story like this maybe, seems like about once a year. We know there's Forrest Fenn's Treasure. We've done an episode on the Beale ciphers. Do those really lead to a hidden buried treasure somewhere? We've got another one we're looking into today. Quite honestly, of all of them, it might be one of the ones that is most feasible. We're going to actually see information kind of on both sides of that by the time we get to the end of today's episode. And we're also going to learn a lot more about a semi-famous gangster from the 1920s into the 30s. Numerous books, movies, all kinds of stuff has been done about this man. Let's go ahead and jump in and get started with just a quick little synopsis from Reader's Digest. It's what they're good at, right? One of the world's most perplexing hidden treasure mysteries is that of the gangster Dutch Schultz, who may or may not have hidden a $7 million fortune somewhere in the Catskill Mountains of New York. What do you guys think? You think he really did it? Let's learn some more information and see what you think by the end of it. Here is a picture of Dutch Schultz. I believe he was only, he was in custody twice. He was actually charged for a crime only once. We're going to hear about some other charges that were brought against him, but he only served time one time in his life, official time for being charged. Let's go ahead and start with some of the backstory. The history of prohibition, one of the least popular ideas in American history, gave rise to a new type of criminal. Names like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky became widely known, and these high-profile thugs built their fortune supplying America's desire for bootleg alcohol. One of the more brutal and notorious of the 1930s-era gangsters was born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer. But since Flegenheimer is hardly a name that inspires dread, the world knew him by the name Dutch Schultz. And from what I understand, and it's hard because a lot of this stuff is legend at this point. We're looking at something that happened, nearly 100 years ago. But there's a few different stories in terms of Dutch Schultz. Either that nickname was given to him when he was in jail very early on. I believe it was just for a robbery that he had committed. But then he tried to escape from jail and they wound up tacking on more time. And I think some other people there started calling him Dutch Schultz, which actually referred to an older gangster from even the pre-1920s, 1930s era. But there's another story that he decided to call himself Dutch Schultz because Arthur Simon Flegenheimer was too long to be on the headline of a newspaper. I don't know which one's true. The newspaper thing kind of sounds like it was made up for a script, but also sounds like it could be the truth. You never know in these types of stories. Let's go ahead and continue at Biography.com. Infamous gangster, bootlegger, and murderer Dutch Schultz was born on August 6, 1902, in the Bronx section of New York City. During his relatively brief life, Dutch Schultz became a powerful figure in the New York crime world, earning the nicknames Beer Baron of the Bronx and the Dutchman. The son of Jewish immigrants from Germany, he grew up in the slums of the Bronx. His father abandoned the family when Schultz was in his early teens, and soon after, Schultz left school and started working odd jobs. From what I understand, some of the jobs that he was working were truck driving jobs, and some of the companies he was working for, they were shipping booze over, Canada, not too far away from this area that he's living in. Canada still making alcohol legally during that time, so I'm sure there was a lot of importing that was going on around that. Schultz soon discovered that crime was more lucrative than a day job. At the age of 17, he was arrested for burglary and served 17 months in prison for the crime, the only prison sentence he would ever serve. After his release, Schultz returned to the streets and his gang of thugs. His associates gave him the nickname Dutch Schultz after a local gangster who was known for his violent, brutal ways. And according to some information I've heard, in about 10 years of him operating in this way, he was he wasn't necessarily the person, but he was responsible for over 130 murders. Seriously, seriously bad news. And this is a guy that stood 5'7" and weighed about 165. Let's go ahead and continue here at freeinfosociety.com. Dutch began strong-arming speakeasies run by competitors into buying his alcohol and violently punishing those who didn't. One tavern owner, Joe Rock, blatantly refused to buy Dutch's liquor and lived to regret it after Dutch kidnapped him. Dutch dragged the man back to an abandoned warehouse where he was hung from meat hooks by his thumbs. Terrible. While he was hanging there, Dutch taped a piece of gauze saturated with discharge from a gonorrhea infection over Rock's eyes. The bacteria infected Rock's eyes, causing him to go blind, and news of this cruelty struck fear into the hearts of speakeasy owners all over town. So he was big into the alcohol game, obviously, also got into some gambling rackets as well, and business protection services, some other things, kind of typical mafia type activities for those times. Over at the NewYorkTimes.com, there was another side that was kind of interesting in terms of the press. So it does seem to me like he is at least press aware. So maybe that story about his name being too long for headlines isn't too far off. On January 22nd of 1933, the New York Times wrote up a profile about Dutch Schultz. And in that profile, they said, Schultz has far less of the legendary gangster glamour about him than most of the so-called public enemies. His weakness for blondes is the open jest of his friends as well as his enemies, and he cannot hold his liquor nearly as well as most of the others of his stripe. Now, Dutch actually wanted to speak to the reporter that wrote that. Dutch Schultz was a gangster he did not want to anger, and Meyer Berger of the Times had infuriated him. A profile Mr. Berger wrote in 1933 about the Bronx bootlegger called him a pushover for a blonde. Outraged, Schultz confronted Mr. Berger in person to demand an explanation for the slander. But it's the truth, isn't it? The reporter asked. Yes, the gangster replied. But what kind of language is that to use in the New York Times? Just wanted to share that with you guys because I think it gives you a little glimpse into his personality. Over at allthat'sinteresting.com, gangster Dutch Schultz died a millionaire, but where did all his money go? Now, that question in particular, I think, is a really strong one, and it's a simple one that just leads to the possibility of maybe he did decide that he wanted to bury his funds somewhere. We're going to get into the details of why he went through that, and maybe he had a very good reason for doing that. If he didn't do that, we know that he's generating millions of dollars with these illegal activities. So ultimately, where was that kept? What happened to it? Where did that money go? Was it stolen by someone else? Did one of his lieutenants take it? There's just a very, very simple mystery in terms of millions of dollars being accumulated, no one seemingly knowing what happened to it or coming out with a story about what happened to it after the fact. Are there some stories? There's a few little tidbits of stories we're going to hit by the end of this, possibly about the amount that he buried, but nothing definitive. And even outside of that, he only buried a certain amount of his money. The numbers that I'm seeing for how much he was generating, I would say that he probably buried maybe a year's worth, maybe at the most 2 years worth of income, according to the numbers I'm seeing him generate just for his liquor sales. So there's still substantial amounts of money. Was it just assumed by other members of these criminal organizations? I don't know, or taken over. Schultz connected with organized crime bosses Lucky Luciano and Legs Diamond. Schultz developed a relationship with fellow criminal Joey Noe, and the two formed their own gang. Schultz's territory was the Bronx, where he grew up. The lucrative part of New York was across the river in Manhattan, where Schultz saw plenty of opportunity. This led to territorial disputes with Italian gangsters. Diamond's turf was in Manhattan, so the mobster ordered a hit on Noe, Schultz's business partner and confidant, in October of 1928. Schultz, retaliated for the killing by offing Diamond's close associate, Arnold Rothstein. Not one to settle for mere lapdogs, Schultz's men were supposedly responsible for Legs Diamond's untimely murder in 1931. Schultz clashed with other gangs as his bootlegging enterprise grew, and rivals feared Schultz would take away their business. Vincent Cole, a former associate of Schultz's, got into a bloody gang war with him in the early 1930s that left dozens dead. The bloodbath didn't stop until Cole was killed in February 1932. The federal government began to pursue Schultz. The feds indicted Schultz in 1933 on income tax evasion charges. If any of you know about the story of Al Capone, this was law enforcement's answer. If they couldn't bust these guys using traditional investigation methods on the actual crimes they were committing, they were getting bookkeepers and using bookkeepers to bust these guys for income tax evasion. These guys are making millions of dollars. They're not paying any tax on that. The gang leader then went into hiding before turning himself in November of 1934. So he turns himself in for the first charge, and basically he gets off. And there's some rumor that he might have been tampering with the jury to make that happen. It seems like when they actually try to bring him in again, he kind of rolls back to that same trick and does a little more. Dutch Schultz's second tax evasion trial was moved to Malone. And let me just make an interesting point. It is so rare that I'm doing a story on BrainScratch about something of a criminal nature like this, and I'm using a Visit This Place website as a source. But this is actually coming from visitmalone.com. Malone in New York, of course. His first was legally tangled enough to require a retrial on charges of tax evasion over his rumored income of a couple of $1 million a month. This setback infuriated New York Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey with implications no one could foresee at the time. And that is the same Thomas Dewey that would eventually run for president. Here were the front page headlines in the New York Times back in 1935. New York gangster Dutch Schultz, tax evasion trial begins. 7 counts dropped in Schultz's trial. Federal move cuts maximum sentence possible to 16 years, $40,000 fine. Defense delay blocked. Further stories detailed how much Dutch Schultz gave toys to sick kids, new jerseys for the town's semi-pro baseball team, money to the local churches, and dinners for everyone else in town. He tipped in $100 bills and bought secret rounds of drinks at local gathering spots. So basically, it seems like he was really kind of pumping the community while he was there and just trying to be seen as this good guy. So buying toys, giving them to sick kids, making donations to churches, free dinners and drinks for people. It's almost like he's playing a political game at that point and winning this town over. In the end, the jury deliberated for only one day. The verdict: Dutch Schultz was acquitted on August 1st, 1935. The courtroom and the crowds outside cheered and applauded. Presiding Judge Bryant, a native of the area, was visibly astonished, disappointed, and thoroughly exasperated, according to the Franklin County Review. Your verdict, he declared, is such that it shakes the confidence of law-abiding citizens in integrity and truth. It will be apparent to all who followed the evidence in this case that you have reached a verdict not on the evidence, but on some other reason. You will go home with the satisfaction, if it is indeed a satisfaction, that you have rendered a blow against law enforcement and given aid and encouragement to people who would flout the law. In all probability, they will commend you. I cannot. Sounds like a pretty upset judge. While Dutch Schultz had triumphed for a second time, the consequences of the trial were not over yet. His legal bills were considerable, and he was also worried that Special Prosecutor Dewey would not rest until he was behind bars. Worried that he would leave jail broke, he buried some treasure, just like an old-time pirate. Dutch Schultz trusted only his longtime bodyguard, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, No one knows the form or size of the treasure he allegedly buried in the Catskill Mountains near Phoenicia, New York. The amounts vary from 5 to 9 million. So the comment here about no one knowing the form or size of the treasure, once again, may or may not be true. Some people do claim to know the details. Some people say that it is Liberty bonds that were in there, cash, possibly gold, certain types of coins, certain types of gems could have been in there. The details about the box kind of vary. I'm seeing a couple sources that say possibly it was suitcases and there was kind of sacks used in these suitcases. Other stories seem to allege that there was some special box that was made that is airtight and watertight. Which might be important because one of the places they're burying this next to is right next to a river running by it. One other thing I just wanted to point out here, I was in Las Vegas recently and I just saw it's funny, I just bumped into this, but I believe this is one of his cars and I think it's on display in Primm, Nevada. So if you're around the area and you want to see his car, you can actually go and do that. But what about this treasure? Can we learn more about it? Jumping over to Catskill.net, and I believe this is an excerpt. I don't know if it's a pamphlet or a whole book, but Dutch Schultz and His Lost Catskills Treasure by John Conway. Schultz found himself doggedly pursued by Dewey for other crimes. Finally, in 1935, he decided that only Dewey's death would put an end to the pursuit, and he devised a plan to knock the prosecutor off. Before carrying out this daring deed, however, Schultz met with the other top-level gangsters on the board of directors of the syndicate to apprise them of his plan. Luciano and Lansky were astute enough to realize that murdering a man of Dewey's stature would bring down considerable heat on their lucrative operations and possibly cost them millions of dollars. So they persuaded the others in the syndicate to vote against Schultz's proposition. This infuriated the Dutchman, who vowed to carry out the assassination on his own. "I don't need your permission," he angrily announced, and stormed out of the meeting. That fit of temper was enough to convince Luciano and Lansky that Schultz was even more unstable than they had initially believed, and, coupled with their own desire to take over the Dutchman's profitable rackets, sealed Schultz's fate. The syndicate would eliminate Schultz and his gang before they could eliminate Dewey. So we've got everything just blowing up in the wrong direction here. Admittedly, he's freaked out because he's got the government just tapping on him time and time again. And who's to say there isn't a third case that's going to be brought against him? There more than likely is. So he's trying to figure out what to do. He's coming up with this scheme about burying his money in case he gets incarcerated, and that way he'll at least have something when he comes out. There's another aspect to the story that when he was going through all this and he was trying to fight his cases, obviously he wasn't really running his enterprise at that time. So there's some stories about other crime leaders that were kind of starting to take over his operations. And then all of a sudden he gets clear of this and he comes back and he's like, okay, well, thanks for handling my stuff. Let me take it back. So I think they were already likely getting a taste of his action, seeing how much money he was making in these areas, and maybe that decision to eliminate him was motivated more than on more than just him wanting to take care of Dewey and take him out of the equation. So I think Schultz actually had several reasons to be nervous. The government looking at him one way, possibly his cohorts in crime looking at him another way and thinking, hey, if he wasn't around, all of a sudden there'd be a little more to go around for all of us. Let's continue. Because of the relentless heat Dewey had succeeded in bringing to bear on him in the city, Schultz had fled across the river to Newark, New Jersey, where he had set up shop in the Palace Chop House, a working-class tavern and restaurant with a low profile. A team of killers, led by Charles Bug Workman, was dispatched to that location on October 23, 1935. Schultz had excused himself from a business meeting in his office just moments before Workman entered the chop house. He was washing his hands in the restroom when the assassin came in, and in a burst of machine gun fire, Schultz was hit several times. The gunman then proceeded to the office, where he quickly and coldly dispatched the others. Schultz had been hit in the spleen, stomach, colon, and liver. He was mortally wounded, but he didn't die right away. He was rushed to Newark City Hospital. In one account that I saw, he actually comes out of the bathroom and he like goes and sits at a table. And he's like still trying to, I mean, he's telling people he needs help, but he's still trying to command kind of what's going on. I guess when authorities show up, Lulu Rosencrantz is one of the other guys that shot at this location. So Schultz and Lulu are the two that went and supposedly buried this treasure somewhere. Supposedly, they're the only two that know where this actually is. So Lulu's also been shot. Schultz is shot. Doesn't look good for either of them. But the wounds to Schultz's men were worse. So the emergency services took them to a hospital first. There's also this story I saw that when Schultz was taken, and I've seen it reported two different ways, he either gave $3,000 to a paramedic and said, make sure I get through this, or he gave $10,000 to a doctor and said, make sure I get through this. The stories both end the same way, where whoever he gave it to wound up putting it back in his bed or giving it back to him in some way because they didn't want to feel like, he would have come collecting a favor from them at some point in the future because of this money that he had laid on them. Really interesting little sub stories around all this. I'm just trying to jam in as much as I can with you guys. But so he had been hit in several organs, mortally wounded, rushed to Newark City Hospital, lingered there for nearly 24 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness. There was an infection. There's also some story that the bullets were rusty intentionally so that a person would get infected if he were shot with them. I don't know if that's really true or not, or if that's just legend, but he did get an infection. The ensuing infection ran his fever up to 106 degrees. The resulting delirium caused a steady stream of chatter, and police stenographer John Long was assigned to write down every single word. It wasn't long before the dying words of Dutch Schultz made their way into the newspapers, and everyone in the world soon knew about the existence of the Dutchman's stashed millions. Oh, mama, 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 I am a pretty good Pretzler. How many shots were fired at me? John, please, did you buy me the hotel for $1 million? I'll get you the cash out of the box. There's enough in it to buy 4, 5 more. You can play jacks, and girls do that with a softball and do tricks with. Lulu, drive me back to Phoenicia. Don't be a dope, Lulu. We better get those Liberty bonds out of the box and cash them. Sure, it was Danny's mistake to buy them, and I think they can be traced. Danny, please get me in the car. Kindly take my shoes off. They're not off. There's handcuffs on them. Wonder who owns these woods. He'll never know what's hidden in them. My gilt-edged stuff and those rats have tuned in. What did that guy shoot me for? Don't let Satan draw you too fast. So as you can see, obviously, there's some ramblings in there as well, but are those really clues? He is referring to a box. He is talking about Phoenicia, but those statements aren't exactly connected to each other. So is this legend just spiraling out of control based off of quotes like this? And there's even variations on these quotes that have been published. Several versions of the treasure tale place the location of the burial ground somewhere along Route 28 between the roadway and the Esopus Creek. One of the most popular stories is that Schultz and Lulu Rosencrantz carried a steel safe containing the loot to Phoenicia on an April night in 1933 and buried it in a grove of pine trees near the Esopus, with the obligatory X marking the specific tree under which the digging was to be done. A more elaborate version of the events surrounding the hiding of the loot was revealed nearly 50 years ago by an old-timer. He was over 80 at the time, and he claimed to have first-hand knowledge. This account was that the treasure was buried the very afternoon Schultz and his gang were ambushed at the Palace Chop House. According to this tale, Dutch and one of his men, probably Lulu Rosencrantz, stopped for lunch at the Phoenicia Hotel in the center of town. They left around 1 o'clock, got in a car, and drove a half block where they made a right-hand turn onto Route 214. They proceeded north along the Stony Clove Creek for about 8 miles and stashed the money beneath the skull-shaped rock formation known as the Devil's Face. Schultz's deathbed ramblings did make a reference or two to Satan. It would seem more likely that the landmark Schultz would have used is the large rock known as the Devil's Tombstone, which is closer to town and considerably more accessible than the 100-foot high rock skull. So yeah, we've got devil references all over this area. So already just trying to make sense out of it. And it's interesting because the references, at least in terms of the map that I'm seeing, are devil. None of them are necessarily Satan. Is it, I mean, this guy's delirious. Could it be that his mind is just kind of swapping out one word for the other? Certainly possible. But looking through all the, I mean, it's like Devil's Tombstone, Devil's Path, Devil's Face, Devil's Rock. Everything is devils out here. So I'm kind of curious a little bit just about this phrasing. This is Devil's Tombstone. And this is a picture of Devil's Face. And you can see it kind of looks like there's a face in the side of the rock there. So the 214 is running through here. Phoenicia is back here. So according to the directions that he was talking about, he does seem right about it more likely being Devil's Tombstone, because the 214, approximately 8 miles up from Phoenicia, you would run into the Devil's Tombstone there. There's another place called Devil's Path Trail that's back over here. But the description he's talking about, it does really seem like what is now known as Devil Tombstone Campground is the location. But people are looking in all kinds of different places, including there's a map that has been released we're going to get to and see how that fits into all this as well. But what happened with this? So we know he supposedly buries his money. We know there's a shootout. We know he dies. What happens? Lucky Luciano, according to gangland lore, spent much of his time obsessively trying to locate the safe. A number of writers have devoted works to his last words, including William S. Burroughs' novel Last Words of Dutch Schultz and Robert Shea and Robert Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy. In the novel, Billy Bathgate, the hero, discovers clues in Schultz's fevered ramblings to locate his hidden treasure. Treasure hunters meet yearly in upstate New York gatherings to hunt for the buried safe, as seen in the 2001 documentary film Digging for Dutch. There is so much media around this, and part of the difficulty in researching was I was running into sources, and I'm like, oh, this is like there's fictional books that are written about this all over the place. So I kept running into those and having to back out. Over at the LA Times, though, some considerations here for the possibility that the money could really be buried or maybe not. Schultz really did make millions from his rackets. I don't think anyone denies that. He traveled upstate, and Depression-era criminals tended to avoid banks except to rob them. Some, like Machine Gun Kelly, were even known to hide loot in the dirt. Still, there is no definitive proof that Schultz buried anything anywhere. Alan May, who writes about organized crime for AmericanMafia.com, doesn't see why Schultz would travel more than 100 miles north to put his fortune in a hole. I don't think it makes any sense at all, May said. He certainly had other places he could have kept it than in the ground. But the story seems too good to die. Some Schultz treasure theorists believe better digging is at a local campground or along the railroad tracks. Local funeral home operators say they have a map placing the treasure directly under what is now State Route 28. Others say it's buried by a rock outcropping called Devil's Face, arguing Schultz uttered a crucial clue as he lay dying: "Don't let Satan draw you too fast." Of course, Schultz also said he eats like a little bologna sausage maker. So others discount that theory. Searchers have tried everything from backhoes to psychics to even the odds. Others believe someone found the treasure long ago and kept quiet. So I did run into a thread, and this is a treasure hunting thread. It's called treasurehunter.net. And there is a man there that supposedly has been trying to look for this for a number of years. He's actually been commenting on this thread for years already. He has his own theory. He actually thinks that he found the site, but he believes that the treasure may have already been taken. At one point in 2009, he decides that he is going to release his maps Now, I'm curious because I don't know if these are maps that he literally drew himself. I don't know if these are supposedly copies of a map that was made. There's another aspect to this story where supposedly Lulu had told one person about the location and had actually drawn a map for this one person. Then some gangsters went and visited that guy, shot him, tried to kill him, supposedly took the map. That guy winds up surviving, but treasure disappears. So I don't know if this is a recreation based off that map, supposedly. That's one of the things I was really trying to do when I was digging into this, was like, what is the source of this map? Where is the story about this map coming from? And even Unsolved Mysteries did coverage on this, and they basically presented the same version of the story that I just told you, where Lulu told someone else about where the location was, and they kind of treated it like that was fact. I can't find sources to actually point to that and say, you know, this person does claim that he had a map at some point, but there is a map now. It is the internet. So if you guys are wanting to go look, here's the information. Of course, I have links to everything in the description box down below. But this is the user GABNN3, who's been commenting on this thread literally for years. Thank God I'm finally over the disappointment and frustration. Posting these maps will set me free at last. Excerpts from the authoritative account are as follows. There was the steel box which a Bronx iron worker, Timothy Keel, constructed to his specifications. It was 3 foot by 2 foot by 18 inches. The Dutchman placed approximately $7 million in $1,000 bills, diamonds, jewelry, gold coin, and various portable wealth. 8 witnesses watched him make this deposit in his Bridgeport, Connecticut hideout. The Dutchman and Lulu placed it in the trunk of a big Packard along with a pick and a shovel. Approaching Phoenicia, the Dutchman ordered Lulu to stop the car. Near a stand of stately pine trees on the bank of the Esopus Creek, they buried the steel box. The map showed the stand of tall pine trees on the creek bank. A cross was marked at the foot of one of the trees. So here are the maps. And it's pretty interesting because the water, the shape of the water, very easy to find if you kind of trace State Route 28 here. And on the map, he also noted there was an area called Boyceville Inn, a building called Boyceville Inn. So pretty easy to find it. This is the area that he is talking about, and supposedly the trees are somewhere in here, and the treasure was at least buried somewhere in this pine grove. There's a second map where he actually has the highway on it, and here's that reference to Boyceville Inn. It's interesting now because he's showing, I don't know if this is a road that is currently going through there. If it is, there might have been some construction. I'm not really seeing it in this satellite view. Maybe it's a trail. Yeah, I bet it's a trail that he had drawn on there. So what happened when he tried to find it? First of all, he says everyone expected to see an X in real life. And from all the different versions of the story that I've been looking at, researching this, it's always referred to as an X. I wonder about that myself. Like, if you're really going to bury something somewhere, particularly something valuable, are you going to use an X to literally mark the spot? Really doesn't sound like a great idea. Some other type of indicator, yeah, but literally an X? According to this guy's story, the burial hole is equidistant between 2 pines, so the box could easily be recovered. The southernmost pine, now fallen, was marked with the carving 1934. So GABNN3 thinks that it was actually buried in 1934, and instead of an X, they actually wrote the year in there, which definitely a little bit less suspicious. I'm trying to think of like how I certainly wouldn't use a smiley face. But if I was going to mark a tree with something valuable like that, I'd want to do something that's kind of less conspicuous. A year is a pretty good thing. I guess you could also do like a heart or, some initials in a heart or something so that people would assume that, some star-crossed lovers came by here at some point, something along those lines. Schultz was indicted in January of 33 and went on the run until he surrendered in November of 34. Kind of makes sense then that he could have buried it in 34. Since my last visit, someone peeled the bark off this tree. Now, that's one of those things that just makes me nervous about this whole story. He literally posted a photo of this supposed tree. Here it is. There's no markings that you can see. There is a big section of the bark missing. But does that really support the story? The thing is, if he wanted to fake it, couldn't he just etch it himself, let it sit out there for a couple months, go back and then take a picture and go, hey, look, guys, I found this. So I'm kind of feeling both ways about it. I could see why it'd be easy for someone to say, oh, yeah, I found this tree. This was the tree. Oh, but the marking's gone. Someone peeled it off. But if I was going to fake that for the internet, I think you would take the extra steps and make it something a little more interesting to try to get you more attention, if that's what you were motivated by. A rival, Shapiro, learned of the map through a mutual female acquaintance, and shortly after Schultz was shot, obtained the map during a botched hit on Marty. So Marty is the friend of Lulu's that Lulu supposedly gave the map to. Then you've got this other guy, Shapiro, learning about the map through a female acquaintance of his that also knew Marty. There's a lot of connectivity going on for this legend, and I don't know. I conclude that Shapiro, with the aid of the map, easily obtained the box. He would not have admitted obtaining it since the government was nailing gangsters for criminal tax violations. Certainly true. And he didn't want to share it with the others who took over Schultz's former territory. Possibly true as well. The Liberty bonds known to have been in the box were undoubtedly destroyed, so they couldn't be traced. That was another interesting thing about the coverage on Unsolved Mysteries, which there's a link to down below as well. There's an expert there talking about this case. He doesn't say how he knows this information, but he says that the Liberty bonds were never cashed in. That would lead me to believe that someone knows some type of serial number or unique identifier for those particular bonds. If that's true and they were never cashed in, that certainly supports the story that there could be a treasure out there somewhere. And, maybe to this person's point, it was collected already and the person didn't cash the bonds in because they realized that they could be traced. But I don't know. I just, how would you know the serial numbers for all that kind of stuff? If he was going to keep record of that, isn't that going to tip off the government to, hey, we know there's other funds because he's got these? I don't know. I'm kind of curious about that. I really wish that they had gone into better detail on Unsolved Mysteries. But in the page about the Unsolved Mysteries version, there's an update that they've added. In his book, Nick the Greek, King of the Gamblers by Cy Rice, legendary gambler Nick the Greek said that before his death, Dutch Schultz gave him a briefcase for safekeeping. After Schultz's death, Nick the Greek opened the briefcase and found that it contained $5 million in $1,000 and $10,000 bills. Up until 1968, $1,000 and $10,000 were available to the general public and could be used at any store. According to Nick, he used this money to replenish his bankroll, and then he gambled it all away. It could be possible that Dutch had liquidated the treasure and gave it to Nick for safekeeping since he couldn't trust most of the men under him. I don't know if I buy this version. We're talking about a gambler here and a book being written about the gambler. It feels like, hey, let's beef this story up a little bit. Yeah, I was given this briefcase by Dutch Schultz. And I don't know why Dutch would have liquidated the treasure like this is saying. And if he did, why wouldn't he have cashed out those Liberty bonds? Or someone would have. At a minimum, he could have given those to someone else, like maybe as a form of payment for his employees or something, let them cash them out. It just really, really seems odd to me, but yet another story in a seemingly unending chain of stories around this case. Over at atlasobscura.com, another interesting point that could support, it could actually work either way on this story. Schultz was also, authorities later found out, running an underground distillery in Pine Plains, New York, that was largely forgotten until recently. Today, that distillery is operating again under the name Dutch's Spirits, and its CEO, Lydia Higginson, says that the new, completely legit this time, operation is still unearthing the remnants of Schultz's original activities. There's some critters down there, Higginson said, referring to a system of underground bunkers and the animals that populate them that Schultz used to conceal his distillery from the prying eyes of the feds. The bunkers have since been evacuated and open to visitors, but before 2010, they were mostly a local rumor. So we have him hiding an entire distillery basically in the ground. And we have that not being discovered until 2010. That kind of pushes me back over to, wow, maybe there's something to this. But then can't you also ask the question, if you have a distillery underground and you have all these secret passages and underground bunkers, if you're going to hide money, why not hide it down there somewhere? Unless you're running by the old rule of don't put all your eggs in one basket. I don't know. But there is a television show that has been filming pretty recently, April 27th, 2019. TV show hunts for gangster Dutch Schultz's lost fortune in Stony Creek. I'm not familiar with this show. It's on the Travel Channel. It's called Code of the Wild. I don't know if the episode has aired yet. Maybe you guys could let me know in the description box below. On top of all the links I'm going to have for everything we looked at, I'm going to include the Wikipedia article, which is a very interesting read, goes much more into his criminal history, but this article has multiple issues. I'm even seeing other articles referring to how weak the information is in the Wikipedia on this. There's so much legend that's built up around this. I think a lot of those legend stories are working their way into this article. So read it with a grain of salt, but I will include that. And as I mentioned, the segment from Unsolved Mysteries about this particular case is in the description box below. Also, I ran into some postings at mysteriouswritings.com by Jenny Kyle. They're very light, just kind of fun. You know, she's gone to the areas a couple times, gone looking around. There's 2 articles in particular. I'll include those down below for anyone that's interested. But what do you think, Brain Scratchers? I don't know. I keep running into information with this where it kind of pushes me one way about, oh, it's possible. I mean, basically we come down to it's out there and no one has found it. Maybe because of this association to Satan and then thinking of these devil's areas. And I don't even know where the story about Phoenicia comes from in the first place. It could be out there in a completely different place that people aren't even looking at. That is a possibility. It could be there and it could just not be discovered yet. I saw one other theory that if it was that close to the river, that there's been floods and maybe the box could have been swept away. An iron box, I don't know. It kind of depends on how it's built, but I don't know if it would deteriorate over close to 100 years at this point. I doubt that it had any type of like plastic lining or something like that. I mean, I would bet that even if there is money in it, it's probably in no shape to actually be used in any way outside of historical value. Gold and gems obviously still would. Or is this just all legend? Is this just completely off the wall? And looking at the stories that I've heard and the connectivity of people, it kind of feels that way a little bit to me. There's a little too much about, so Lulu talks to this guy talks to a blonde. The blonde tells her gangster boyfriend. He comes back and shoots this guy and takes his map. It could be. It sounds a bit like a 1930s, 1940s detective story. And if it is a legend that's sprouting up at that time, aren't those types of writing conventions and what's popular in terms of pop culture going to seep into the legend? Is that what we're seeing here? Or are those really just true signs of the times where you had gangsters that were so interconnected, something like that is completely feasible? I don't know. That's why I'm bringing it up and sharing it with you guys, and I hope you can help me figure this all out in the comments down below. Hope you guys enjoyed that little bit of a detour of a brain scratch. Like I said, I only do those stories about once a year or so, but I'm always really intrigued by it. I think there's just a natural attraction to that when people think about hidden treasure. You know, it's kind of part of the allure of like pirates and stuff like that. Oh, there's something buried in the ground and I can get a metal detector and I can take a vacation and I can go out there and try to find it and come home with a bunch of, shell casings and tin cans or whatever other things people are finding on that. But I do think it's fun, and I hope that you guys enjoyed that as well. Before I end today's video, I want to give a very big thank you to new patron Sarah Parker Schemelt. Hope I'm saying that right, Sarah. I'm trying my best. Jessica Steele, and a big thank you to Melissa Landazuri for increasing her pledge. If you want to support the channel on Patreon, you can go to www.lordandarts.com. We've got the Patreon link. We've got the PayPal link. There's merchandise. There's an audiobook. All that stuff helps support the channel, keeping me here doing what I love doing, hanging out with you. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday with a brand new episode of Case Cracked on the Lord and Arts channel.